The trauma bay on Meridian Station 7 had treated every kind of wound the galaxy could produce, but nobody wanted to touch the man on bed 4. 3 doctors had already walked away from him in the last 11 minutes, and the 4th was halfway out the door when a nurse in a blood-streaked blue coat stepped directly into his path and said 2 words, "Move aside." Dr. Thallenbacher froze mid-step, his 4 eyes blinking out of sync, the way they always did when he was startled. "Excuse me? You heard me." Willa Hart didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 11 years of trauma medicine had taught her that panic sounded loudest when it was quiet. "You're not walking out of this bay while that man is still breathing." "That man," Thallen said, glancing back at the ruined body strapped to the gurney, "is a Kesari war officer with a security clearance we cannot verify, biology none of us are certified to touch, and a political status that could get this entire station stripped of its neutrality charter. I am not losing my license over a corpse that hasn't finished dying yet." Around them, the trauma bay kept running the way it always did, alarms chirping in 4 different alien registers, a Valtherian medbot rolling past with a tray of surgical foam, the low hum of the station's gravity plating fighting a losing battle against a solar flare 3 systems away. Nobody else even looked up. That was the part that would stay with Willa long after that night ended. Not the blood. Not the alarms. The fact that an entire trauma bay full of trained professionals had simply decided a dying man wasn't worth the risk. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a second, because it's the whole reason this story exists at all. When every single expert in the room says a patient is a lost cause, what does it actually mean when the least qualified person there refuses to agree? Is it courage? Is it stubbornness? Or is it something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with a debt nobody in that room knew she was carrying? Keep that question in your pocket. You're going to need it. Willa had been on shift for 16 hours when the emergency shuttle screamed into the station's lower bay, its hull scorched black, its transponder wiped clean. Whoever had put the man inside that escape pod hadn't wanted him found. They'd also, apparently, not cared much whether he lived or died in transit, because by the time station security cracked the pod open, he'd already lost enough blood to kill 3 humans. He wasn't human. That much was obvious from the first look: the gray-toned skin, the elongated bone structure along his jaw, the twin pulse points at his throat where a human would only have one. Kesari. Willa had seen exactly 1 Kesari in her life before that night, and the memory of it had never fully let go of her. Though she hadn't told anyone that, not once, not in 2 years. "He's Dominion military," said Dr. Isolde Kren, arms crossed, keeping a careful 3 meters between herself and the gurney. Isolde ran diagnostics for the station and had a reputation for being right about 90% of the time, which was exactly why nobody liked working with her the other 10. Command rank markings on what's left of the armor, which means treating him without Dominion authorization isn't just risky, Nurse Hart, it's a treaty violation. The interstitial accord is very specific about non-interference in internal Kesari matters. "He's not asking for interference," Willa said. "He's dying. He's dying because someone wanted him to," Isolde said flatly. "Look at the wound pattern. That's not battle damage. That's an execution that didn't finish the job. Somebody in his own chain of command tried to kill him and failed, and if we save him, we've just made ourselves a target for whoever tried the first time." That should have been the moment Willa backed off. She knew it, even then, standing in the wreckage of a decision she hadn't fully made yet. Every rational argument in the room was pointing the same direction, away from the man, away from the risk, away from the very obvious, very career-ending mess bleeding out on bed 4. She should have let the more senior doctors handle it, or not handle it, whichever they chose, and gone back to the 12 other patients still waiting for her attention. Instead, she looked at his face. There was a scar above his left brow, thin and pale against the gray, shaped like a broken spiral. She'd only ever seen a mark like that once, 2 years ago, on a colony called Corin's Reach, during the worst night of her life, when a masked Kesari officer had come out of the smoke and the screaming and pulled 11 civilians out of a burning shuttle bay with his bare hands, then vanished before anyone could get a name. She had never told anyone that story properly. Command had written it up as an unexplained rescue by an unidentified party and moved on, because in the middle of a war, a mercy nobody could confirm wasn't worth chasing. But Willa had chased it, quietly, for 2 years, in the part of her mind she didn't let anyone see. And now that same scar was lying 6 inches from her hand, attached to a body that 3 doctors had just agreed wasn't worth saving. "I'm taking the case," she said. "Doctor." Thalen made a sound low in his throat that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so tired. "You're a nurse." "I'm the nurse who's still standing here," Willa said. "Which, from where I'm sitting, makes me the most qualified person in this room." Administrator Corin Vashtal arrived 4 minutes later, summoned by a page from station security the moment word got out that a Dominion officer was bleeding out in the civilian trauma bay. Vashtal was Threll-born, tall and narrow-shouldered, with the kind of careful, measured voice that came from decades of telling people bad news in ways that sounded almost reasonable. "Nurse Hart." He didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need you to step away from that patient. With respect, sir." "No, this isn't a request. If you treat him without Dominion clearance and he dies on this table, the Kesari government could claim we killed one of their own officers on neutral ground. If he lives, they could claim we're harboring a fugitive from their internal justice system. Either outcome puts this station's charter at risk, and 11,000 people depend on this station remaining neutral territory. Do you understand what you're gambling with?" "I understand what he's gambling with," Willa said, nodding down at the man on the table, whose chest had just stopped rising for 4 full seconds before stuttering back into motion. "Which is everything. Right now, while we're having this conversation." Vashtal's jaw tightened. "If this goes badly, I will not be able to protect your position here. I'm not asking you to." There was a silence in the trauma bay that felt heavier than it should have. Given that nobody had actually stopped moving, the alarms kept chirping, the medbot kept rolling, but something had shifted. The particular quiet that settles over a room when someone has just made a choice that can't be walked back. "Fine," Vashtal said finally, because he was, whatever else he was, not a man who enjoyed watching people die on principle. "It's your license. Move fast." She was already moving. "Now, if you've never worked a trauma floor, let me put this in terms that'll actually land. Kesari physiology runs on 2 hearts instead of 1, positioned asymmetrically instead of centered, which means every human cardiac protocol Willa had ever trained on was worse than useless. It was actively dangerous, built for an anatomy that simply wasn't in front of her. Their blood oxidizes on contact with standard station atmosphere within 90 seconds, turning from a deep violet to a thick, clotting black that stops flowing entirely if it isn't sealed fast enough. And their claws, retracted under normal circumstances, spring out involuntarily under extreme neurological stress, which meant the man she was about to put her hands on could, without meaning to, take her fingers off if his brain so much as flickered the wrong way. She had 11 years of ER experience on a border colony that didn't have the budget for xenomedical specialists, which meant she'd learned to treat what was in front of her instead of what the manual said should be in front of her. It was the only reason she had any business touching this case at all. And it was, in the next 4 minutes, the only reason he didn't die. She packed the primary wound with clotting foam meant for a species with entirely different blood chemistry, adjusting the mixture on instinct after the first application failed to seal, working from the way the tissue reacted instead of the way a textbook said it should. She rerouted a human cardiac stabilizer through a jury-rigged secondary line, splitting its output between his 2 hearts by feel, listening for the rhythm instead of trusting a monitor that had no idea what it was looking at. Isolde stood at the edge of the bay the entire time, arms still crossed, watching with an expression that had slowly stopped being disapproval and started being something closer to disbelief. "That should not be working," Isolde said quietly, watching the second heart's rhythm steady on the monitor. "It's not supposed to be working," Willa said, not looking up. "It's supposed to be keeping him alive until something better comes along. There's a difference. Here's the thing about that room, and about every room like it. Every single doctor standing there had years of formal xenoanatomy training. Willa had a decade of farm colony triage and a refusal to let go of a man she'd spent 2 years wondering about. In that moment, only one of those things was actually saving his life. I'll let you sit with which one for now." It was somewhere in the 3rd minute, elbow deep in a procedure no manual had prepared her for, that his eyes opened. Nobody expected it. His vitals hadn't cleared the threshold for consciousness, not by any reading on the monitor. and the sedation should have kept him under for another 20 minutes at minimum. But his eyes opened anyway, amber and unfocused, sweeping the ceiling before landing, with a suddenness that made her breath catch, directly on her face. His hand shot up and closed around her wrist. Not a flail, not a seizure, a grip, deliberate and precise, strong enough to bruise. And his claws, the claws Isolde had warned her about, the ones that came out under neurological stress and could shred a hand to ribbons, stayed sheathed the entire time. Every muscle in his arm was fighting his own instincts to keep them retracted. "Hart," he said. His voice was wrecked, barely a whisper, but the word was unmistakable, and it landed in the trauma bay like a dropped weapon. Corin's reach. Willa's entire body went cold and electric at once. Nobody in this room knew that name. Nobody in this room knew what had happened on that colony 2 years ago, or that she'd spent every quiet night since wondering whether the man who'd saved her people had survived whatever came after. And now he was lying on her table, half dead, saying her name like he'd been carrying it the same way she'd carried his scar. "You remember me," she said, and it wasn't a question, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. His grip tightened, just slightly, just enough to answer her without another word. Then his eyes rolled back and his whole body went rigid, both hearts stuttering into an arrhythmic spike that sent every monitor in the bay screaming at once. "He's crashing." Isolde was moving now, all her hesitation gone, hands already reaching for the secondary line. "Hart, I need you to." The trauma bay doors blew open before she could finish the sentence. 4 coalition security officers came through first, weapons drawn, followed by a 5th figure in Dominion diplomatic colors, a Kesari political attaché with cold official eyes that swept the room and landed on the man convulsing on bed 4 like he'd just found exactly what he'd been sent to find. "Step away from the patient," the attaché said, his translator flattening every syllable into something clipped and final. "That officer is the property of the Kesari Dominion, and under Interstitial Accord Provision 9, you are to surrender him into our custody immediately." Willa didn't move. Her hand was still wrapped around his, the monitor behind her screaming a rhythm that meant he had, at most, minutes left, and she had just learned that the man beneath her hands had remembered her for 2 straight years across a war that should have erased everything else. She looked up at 4 leveled weapons, at an administrator who had just told her he couldn't protect her, at a dying man who'd whispered her name like a password to a door she hadn't known was still open, and she didn't let go. "That's where I'm going to leave you, because what happens in the next 60 seconds decides whether Commander Rendalkar lives long enough to explain any of this, and whether the woman holding his hand is about to lose a great deal more than her job." The attaché's finger hovered near the sidearm at his hip, and for one long second, nobody in the trauma bay breathed. "Nurse Hart," Administrator Vashtal said, stepping between the leveled weapons and the gurney with a calm that Willa suspected was costing him everything he had. "Step back. Let me handle this." "He'll die if I step back," Willa said. "His hearts are out of sync, and I'm the only one in this room who's had a hand on that stabilizer line. You want to argue jurisdiction, argue it over a corpse, but you're not doing it while I'm the only thing keeping him breathing." The attaché's eyes narrowed, but it was Vashtal who spoke next, and what came out of his mouth surprised everyone in the room, including, Willa suspected, himself. "She's right, and more importantly, she's protected." He turned to the attaché with the particular stiffness of a man reciting something he'd hoped never to need. Interstitial Accord, Medical Annex, Section 12. Any patient under active life-saving treatment on neutral station ground cannot be removed, transferred, or otherwise interfered with until a station-certified physician declares them stable. That's not station policy, Attaché Corvith. That's treaty law, and you signed it same as we did. Corvith's jaw worked. That officer is a fugitive from Dominion military justice. Every second you delay is a second a second he stays alive, Vashtal said, which, last I checked, is generally the point of a hospital. Here's a question I want to drop in your lap for a second, because it's going to matter in about 4 minutes. When someone shows up in a full diplomatic uniform, using the right words, citing the right law, and demanding a dying man be handed over for justice, how do you know if you're looking at the law or just someone wearing it? Hold on to that. It's the whole back half of this story. Isolde didn't wait for the standoff to resolve. She'd already gone back to the monitor, hands flying across the readout, and the second heart's rhythm was sliding sideways again, that same rigid, thrashing spike from before, and this time it wasn't slowing down. "Hart, I need you now," she snapped, and whatever professional distance had existed between them an hour ago was simply gone, burned off by the fact that they were both, in that moment, just two people trying to keep a heart beating that didn't want to. Willa dropped back into position, both hands finding the secondary line by feel, because there wasn't time to look. The clotting foam had held, mostly, but the arrhythmia was a different animal entirely, something electrical and violent tearing through a nervous system that had already been pushed past its limits once tonight. She adjusted the stabilizer's output again, splitting the current differently this time, watching not the monitor but the muscle beneath her fingers, the way it jumped and settled, jumped and settled. "Come on," she said, low, almost to herself. "You didn't survive 2 years hiding from your own people just to die on my table because I couldn't get the ratio right." Behind her, the standoff had gone quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was watching the same thing. Even Corvith, for all his cold efficiency, had stopped talking. Whatever else he was watching a woman with her hands buried in the chest of a man from a species not her own, fighting for a life that had, by every rule he understood, already been forfeit. The second heart caught, stumbled, caught again, and then, slowly, it settled into something that looked almost like rhythm. Willa exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 minutes. "He's stable," Isolde said, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, not warmth, exactly, but the particular respect that trauma medicine earns the hard way, the kind that doesn't care what species taught you or where. Barely, but stable. Corvith stepped forward again the second the word left Isolde's mouth, as if he'd only been waiting for a technical opening. "Then he is stable enough for transfer. He's stable enough to survive the next hour," Vashtal said. "Not a shuttle flight to a Dominion vessel that may or may not have the equipment to keep him alive. You'll get your custody hearing. Attach, you'll get it through the proper channel, in front of a council arbiter, same as anyone else. What you will not get is a body." It was in the silence after that, thick and unresolved, that Dalkar's hand found Willa's wrist again. His eyes were open, clearer this time, though his skin had gone a shade paler and his breathing came in careful, measured pulls. The way you breathe when every part of you hurts, and you've decided not to let it show. He looked past her, at Corvith, and something in his face changed. Not fear, recognition, and beneath it, a tired, resigned kind of contempt. "He's not here to arrest me," Dalkar said, his voice thin but steady. "He's here to finish it." The trauma bay went very still. "That's a serious accusation," Corvith said, "from a man wanted for treason." "I'm wanted," Dalkar said, "because 2 years ago I disobeyed a direct order to let a civilian shuttle bay burn at Corin's Reach. 11 people were inside. Command had already written them off as acceptable loss in the strike report. I pulled them out anyway, and I never filed a correction to that report, because filing it would have meant admitting I'd broken formation under fire to save coalition civilians instead of holding the line." His gaze flicked, just briefly, to Willa. "I didn't regret it. I have never once regretted it. But my command did not forgive it, and they have spent 2 years deciding what to do with an officer who proved in front of witnesses that mercy was still possible. Now I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is the part of the story that actually earns the title. This isn't a man who got unlucky. This is a man who made one decision on one terrible night to be kind when kindness cost him everything, and he has been quietly paying that debt down ever since, while the woman he saved spent 2 years wondering if he'd survived it. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole shape of the story, and we're about to find out if it gets a happy ending." "Lies," Corvith said, but the word came out too fast, too clipped, missing the practiced calm he'd carried into the room. "I am here on lawful Dominion authority to show me your authorization," Vashtal said quietly. "I don't answer to station administration. You answer to the interstitial accord, same as I do, and the accord requires written extradition authority signed by a Dominion tribunal for any custody transfer of a wounded officer. I've asked twice. You've produced nothing but a uniform and a demand." Vashtal's voice hadn't risen once, but something in it had gone hard as durasteel. "Show me the authorization. Attach Corvith. Or step back from this bay." Corvith's hand moved, not toward a document pad but toward the sidearm at his hip, and it happened fast enough that only Willa, standing closest, close enough to feel Dalkar's grip tighten in warning half a second before it happened, actually saw it coming. "Down," she shouted, and threw herself sideways across the gurney, shielding Dalkar's chest with her own body as the first shot went wide, scorching a black line across the wall panel where his head had been a heartbeat earlier. What followed took 11 seconds, though it felt considerably longer to everyone standing in it. 2 of the Coalition security officers, the real ones, the ones who'd come through the door following actual protocol, tackled Corvith before he could level a second shot, wrestling the weapon from his grip while he screamed something in a dialect the translators struggled to render cleanly, something about honor and unfinished business, and a dominion that would thank him. Isolde had already thrown herself flat behind the monitor bank. Thalon, who had walked away from this exact patient less than half an hour earlier, had somehow ended up closest to the door, bracing it shut with his own weight against anyone else trying to come through. And Willa was still lying half over the gurney, heart hammering, one hand pressed flat against Dalkar's chest, feeling both his hearts pounding fast and hard and, impossibly, still in rhythm. "You're all right," she said, more to herself than to him, checking him over with hands that weren't quite steady. "You're all right. Nobody's cutting through you tonight. Not on my table." He looked up at her, and something in his expression had softened past the pain, past the exhaustion, into something quieter. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," she said. "I did." Security had Corvith restrained within seconds, and the truth came out in pieces after that. The way these things always do once the adrenaline drains and people stop performing whatever role they'd walked in wearing. Corvith wasn't Dominion Diplomatic Corps at all, not officially. His credentials, when a real council arbiter finally reviewed them an hour later, turned out to be forged well enough to pass a cursory check but not a formal one good enough to get him into a civilian trauma bay with a weapon, not good enough to survive actual scrutiny. He'd been sent, off the books, by the same faction in Dalkar's command that had tried and failed to kill him once already, dispatched the moment word leaked that their unfinished business had washed up alive on a neutral station. They knew he'd survive the crash, Vashtal said later, standing at the edge of the recovery ward with the weary posture of a man who'd aged 5 years in one shift. They needed to be certain he didn't survive the hospital. Isolde, cleaning foam residue from her hands at the basin, glanced sideways at Willa. "You knew him, before tonight." It wasn't quite a question, but Willa answered it anyway, because after everything that had just happened, there didn't seem to be much point in guarding it anymore. 2 years ago, Corin's Reach. I was part of the evacuation crew. He pulled 11 of us out of a burning shuttle bay and disappeared before anyone got a name. I've spent 2 years wondering if he made it out. She looked through the recovery ward doorway to where Dalkar lay sleeping, both hearts finally settled into an easy, steady rhythm on the monitor. "I didn't know until tonight that he'd spent the same 2 years paying for it. That's not a coincidence most people get," Isolde said. "Most debts like that don't come back around to be repaid." "No," Willa agreed, "they don't." He woke fully some 6 hours later, in the quiet stretch of station night cycle, when the corridors thinned out and the trauma bay finally, blessedly, went still. Willa was still there, technically off shift, sitting in the chair beside his bed with a cup of station-issue caf gone cold in her hands, because she'd told herself she was only staying to monitor the readouts, and both of them knew that wasn't the whole truth. "You stayed," he said, voice stronger now, rough with sleep. "Somebody had to make sure Corvith's friends didn't send a second one. That's not why you stayed." He said it gently, not as an accusation, and when she didn't answer right away, something like a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, careful, like he wasn't sure his face still remembered how. "I looked for you. After Corin's Reach. Quietly, it's not easy, finding one nurse across Coalition space when you're not supposed to be looking. When looking at all could get you flagged as compromised. I never found a name, just a description, and a rumor that the medical officer who'd organized the evacuation was still stationed somewhere along the border. You could have died tonight not knowing I ever found out what you did for us." "I know." He said it simply, without drama. The way people say true things when they've had a long time to sit with them. "I decided a while ago that it didn't matter whether you ever knew. What mattered was that it happened, that 11 people got to keep living lives I'll never see, because of one decision on one bad night. That was enough. It had to be enough, because I wasn't sure I'd ever get anything more than that. Willa set the cold calf down on the side table and reached for his hand, the same one that had gripped her wrist in the trauma bay hours earlier, and this time there was no crisis pulling them together, no monitor screaming behind them, just two people who had, against every reasonable expectation, found their way back to the same room. "You've got more than that now," she said. "So it seems. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure how this one was going to end when I first sat down with it, because stories about doing the right thing when everyone around you says don't rarely get to land soft. Most of the time, the person who says move aside pays for it. But every once in a while, the debt comes back around the other way. And the very same stubbornness that got a nurse in trouble with 3 doctors and an administrator turns out to be the exact thing that finally gets a good man's 2-year-old mercy repaid in full. That's the part of this story I keep coming back to. Not the surgery, not even the standoff, just the quiet fact that somewhere out there, doing the right thing at the wrong time still occasionally finds its way home. The council arbiter's hearing, 3 days later, went about as well as it could have. With Corvith's forged credentials laid bare, and Dalkar's own testimony on record, the fabricated treason charge unraveled fast, and what remained was simpler than anyone expected. A decorated officer who had once chosen civilian lives over a kill order, hunted quietly for it ever since, now granted formal protected status on neutral ground while his case worked through Dominion channels the slow, legitimate way. It wasn't a full pardon. Nobody promised him that. But it was a door left open instead of a wall closed shut, and after 2 years of running, that was more than he'd let himself hope for. Willa walked him out of the recovery ward herself the morning he was finally cleared for transfer to a longer-term care unit, his steps still careful, his grip still strong on the cane the medbot had insisted on, and neither of them said much, because some things don't need saying twice. "I'll be around," he told her at the doorway. "This station for a while at least, if that's all right with you." "It's more than all right," she said. "Just don't wait 2 years to say hello next time." If this story hit something for you, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. And if you're new here, stick around and subscribe, because there's a whole lot more of humanity being stubborn, kind, and impossible to underestimate still waiting to be told. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that saying no to the room isn't the same as being wrong. Thanks for staying until the end. This is one I won't forget writing.